We're starting a new section in our book. Hold on. Let's do this first. Hi. So we're starting a new section in our book, and it's the pelvis and thighs. And again, the pelvis is the thing that receives your vertebral column. And tiny, tiny differences in rotation down here, you can imagine, would mean that the vertebral column must adjust. It must adjust. Your head weighs about 10 pounds, not to mention your whole thoracic region, and there's no way for me to tweak, even just by half a centimeter, my pelvis without having my vertebral column have to move. It's not the end of the world, but it has to move. And so what happens is very important to kind of remember for back problems. When the vertebral column, when the pelvis does an anterior tilt, which means the top part of it tilts forward. Remember, when you have an anterior tilt, top goes forward, bottom goes back. Top goes forward, bottom goes back, because it's just rotating. But we call this an anterior tilt. The top goes forward. When you have anterior tilts, they tend to make your butt stick out, and they exaggerate the curves of your spine. Because what happens, in order to get my head back over my pelvis, I've got to exaggerate stuff. When I posteriorly tilt, my butt tucks under, and I lose the curves in my spine. And the curves in my spine are a good thing. We don't want them exaggerated, and we don't want them to disappear. They need to be there to shock absorb, but if they're exaggerated, then they kind of crush on themselves and cause all sorts of problems. And if they're gone, they don't shock absorb at all. So that's just one thing that can happen. So anterior tilts tend to cause exaggerated curves in the spine, and they're the most common thing that we see. And that's because when you sit down for long periods of time, the muscles in front of your pelvis tighten up. So when you stand up, you don't straighten up all the way, and I'll show you that in just a second. And posterior tilts are less common, but they tend to take away the curves of your spine. You will sometimes see posterior tilts on heavy-set men like me, because what we are doing, let me get back here far enough. Look down at me here, camera, come on. All right, what we are doing is, I'm being lazy. This belly takes effort to carry around. And so if I throw my weight back here, I'm carrying it over my center, right? And I walk around like this. It's kind of sexy. So I know you're thinking it. I'm just going to say it, okay? So anyway, yeah, thank you, Ms. Everett. So you will sometimes see, not just guys, but this is a very common thing. And what I'm doing is the heaviest part of my body is my belly. I've carried over here. Well, I've kind of straightened my spine up down here, but I've also got to thrust my head forward. Now you got this. This is a posteriorly tilted pelvis, and this is somebody carrying their weight like this. You'll see this. But more commonly, what we see is this in people. This is actually an anteriorly tilted pelvis, which kicks my butt out, exaggerates my spines, and kind of makes me look a little bit like a duck. And we see that because the muscles up here, when I'm sitting down, get tight, and when I stand up, they won't open up all the way. And if they don't open up all the way, I'm slightly tilted forward. And I can't walk like this. So what I do is I exaggerate my spine to try to get my head back over here. Now, people don't think about this. The body does it naturally. Your body is just trying to conserve energy and just make things work. It's trying to get your head back over your feet. So it's just like when you guys lift up a heavy suitcase, you don't think about it, but you lean. You have to. In fact, if you stand here and just try to lean over just a couple of inches to the side without moving anything, you're gonna fall. Like, you can't do it. I've got to stick something out, or I've got to bend my body out. And so people tend to, when the hips go this way, shoulders go this way, head goes this way. People, when their hips go that way, their shoulders go that way to balance out, their head goes back over. They tend to try to balance themselves out with these S curves, laterally and medially, or anteriorly and posteriorly. So a lot of that is the back reacting to the hips. So everybody comes in with back and neck problems, but back and neck problems are usually hip problems. Now, And by the way, I realize I've said all this before, but I think some stuff bears hearing 7 times. Now, make sure when they come in with back and neck problems that you rub their back and neck. In fact, I'd start with that because people get very irritated. That's what's been hurting them all week, all month, all year, and you work on that first. But then I say, hey, I think this might be related to your pelvic alignment. And so I'd also like to do some stuff to loosen up your pelvis so that it's in the proper alignment or whatever you're doing there. Because that's more likely to get them long-term relief. If I have an anteriorly tilted pelvis, which means my pelvis is forward, my neck is always going to be sore because it's always trying to pull my head back here like this. I'm obviously exaggerating this for illustration. People that have this, it's much more mild. It's just kind of like this. But it's there. Anyway, rubbing the neck will make it feel better for about a day or two, but fixing this will correct the neck problem. So rub the thing that's bothering them, but then try to correct the problem. And hopefully if you do that, you will hear comments like this. Gosh, when I get massages from you, they don't seem that different from other people, but I feel better for so much longer. That means you're a very good therapist, and what you've done is you've started to fix the original problem. Now, the reason they don't feel better forever usually is because, like let's say my case, until I lose that weight in front, nothing's going to fix things. So you're going to realign my pelvis and things like that, it's going to help. But until I stop carrying my weight that way or have weight to carry that way, that's going to be a problem. Until somebody stops sitting at a desk, 40 hours a week, this is never going to completely go away. But we want as long-lasting results as you can imagine. You would think we wouldn't because you think we want them to come back to us, but we really want to get people deep relief. And it's so tricky. It's so tricky giving people real lasting relief in an hour or two when they've been messing up their body for 20 years, right? That you don't want to hold back. I've had therapists be like, well, I like to leave something to work on the next time. I'm like, if you've got time, work on it. Because it's not that simple, right? And I want to blow them away. All right. So that's why the pelvis is so exciting. That's why all this stuff is so cool. And let's talk about the pelvis. We've kind of talked about the spine. Let me see if I can get our camera to stop following me. Oh, stop. Good, I think. All right. He wants to go to this thing, huh? This guy might be a problem for what we're doing now. Oh, yeah, you are. All right, stop looking at me. Sorry, everybody. Mr. Richards, I didn't mean you. But that's adorable. I'm going to have to switch cameras here. It's so silly. I was all excited about this thing, and now it's a problem. Stop. Good. All right, I got it. Okay, try this, buddy. Aha. Okay. If it's going to follow me, we'll do this. I love it. So, this is the pelvis. Remember, it's made up of 3 bones. This top big crest bone. Oh, no. Oh, now let's go. There we go. Come on down. Oh. Ooh, there we go. This top big crest bone is your ilium. This bone in front in your pubic region is your pubis. This bone in back that you sit on that you can actually feel poking through your butt is your ischium. These were originally 3 bones that actually fused together to make your hip. The ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And they actually fuse together at the hole where your femur hooks in. This hole is called your acetabulum. It's the tab where you hook your ass. Acetabulum. That's not why it's named that, just how I remember it. And it is a true ball and socket joint. I know that we categorize the shoulder, the glenohumeral joint, as a ball and socket joint, but this sucker is a ball and socket. you don't usually hear of people truly dislocating their hip. They pull their hip, but to get this thing to come out of your hip, if you watched hip replacement surgeries, they use a crowbar to get that thing out. Yeah, they're psycho. You're just like, oh my God. They pull out this ball, they slice it off here, they screw in a new one, and they put it back in. It's murder. And then they get the people up and walking like 4 hours later. Anyway, but it's a true ball and socket. It's a big ball. It's about the size of a golf ball, and it really is fitting in a socket in there. And believe it or not, there's a ligament deep inside the hole that's hooked to the head of the ball and inside the hole. Even if you removed all the muscle, you got to go in there and cut that ligament. And there's ligaments all around here and everything. It's a very massive joint. But that is the acetabulum, and so some people call this the acetabular femoral joint. The femur meets the acetabular femoral joint. That's what I call it too. Remember, we call the ball and socket of the shoulder the glenal humeral joint, acetabular femoral joint. Kind of makes sense. We name it by the two things that come together. People also call this the coxal joint. And you could probably call it the hip joint because that's what it is. It can't, it's not like the shoulders that have all those other joints involved. It's the coxal joint, acetabular femoral joint, hip joint. I prefer acetabular femoral because it shows that you know what you're talking about. But that's there. Those are some features there. So, Mr. Richards, please.
So when they say iliac, does that mean just the edge?
When they say iliac what?
Crest.
Yes, sir. So
the edge.
Yes, the ilium is actually this whole big thing here, but usually they're talking about the iliac crest, which is this edge. And sir, it's a great question, and we're going to use it a lot. This would be the anterior iliac crest. I move all the way to the back. This is the posterior iliac crest. And these names become very important because there's all these bumps on the hip where muscles attach. And all the bumps have names. So if you don't know that this is the ilium and the iliac crest and things like that, it's very hard to find other stuff. So let me give you a great example. If I follow the iliac crest anteriorly, I come to a bump right here that sticks out. It's hard to see in the screen, but it's here, and you can all feel it on yourself. All right? This is a bump you'll see on like swimsuit models. You have to be very slender, but you can see it. And it's a bump right here, and there's a bump below it down here. Now, bumps are sometimes called protuberances and things like that, but they're also sometimes called spines. Remember, your spine is not just your spine. So things that stick out are called spines. And this is the anterior, because it's in front, superior, because it's above this one, iliac spine. You'll hear massage therapists refer to it as ASIS, or as is. It is the anterior superior iliac spine. Yes, Ms. Green, please.
What you said, the iliac crest, is that what you just said?
Yeah, this is your ilium or your iliac crest.
Uh-huh.
And if we follow the iliac crest down to here, there's a bump down here. You can feel it on your own hip if you feel down there. And that is your anterior in front, superior up, because there's one below it, iliac spine.
Iliac spine.
Yeah. The reason your spine is called your spine is it has bumps sticking out of it. Spine actually means something sticking out. So this is the anterior superior iliac spine. There's one below it called your anterior inferior iliac spine. Yeah, and why do I care so much about these, everybody? Because some super important stuff attaches here. For one thing, by the way, if stuff attaches in front, Mr. Singletary, please, yes.
There's a visual on page 279 to keep track with you.
Yes, and I'm going to be showing that slideshow too. I mean, feel free to keep track of me. I think that's a good idea. But I also want to let you know I'll go over the slide thing too, but I just wanted to kind of talk to you on a skeleton too. But you're absolutely right. Thank you, Mr. Singletary. I care about stuff like this because stuff that attaches in front of the hips tends to create flexions of the hip. Remember, flexions happen in front? Well, a flexion is when the femur comes up, right? This femur won't come up very well. When the femur comes up, that's a flexion. But if the femur doesn't come up and you do a flexion, what happens? Jeez. and your hip doesn't stop working. There. If the femur doesn't come up and the leg stays down, but those muscles still shorten, what happens? Mr. Overman.
Would it be an anterior tilt?
Thank you, Mr. Overman. That's actually one of the most important concepts, what he just outlined right there in pelvic theory. So you still bend at the hip, right? We said it doesn't matter if the origin comes to the insertion comes to the origin, but if those muscles are tight, something's coming to something. Well, if I'm standing up and I can't flex if my femur can't come up, my hip comes down. And that is an anterior tilt where the top comes down. So when your hip flexor muscles are tight, it tends to cause anterior tilts. And there are hip flexor muscles that attach to these things, these bumps here that I'll talk about in just a second. Yes, Ms. Correa.
I was wondering if you could physically show, I'm so sorry, I'm trying to understand it.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking like, it's like your top will go forward and
That
I
is,
guess I'm just not understanding it.
that is it. That is it. So,
Okay.
let me get up though. You're absolutely right. So, if we look at me here, if I have a flexion of the hip, this is called a flexion of the acetabular femoral joint, a flexion of the coxal joint, a flexion of the hip. They're all the same thing. It means that muscles in front that are attached to my hip and my femur shorten. Doesn't matter what muscles right now. They shorten. So, if that happens, my femur has to get closer to my hip. Now, there are two ways for that to happen. Either my femur comes up, right? Is my femur getting close to my hip? Or my hip goes down. But if you were floating in outer space, there's no difference. Right? This is kind of like the elbow thing. This is flexion, and this is flexion. Right? This is still flexion of my elbow. If I'm holding a bar here, over here, I would come to it. If I'm holding a dumbbell, it'll come to me. But I'm still flexing the elbow. That's true with hip. So a flexion of the hip really is an anterior tilt of the hip. And that's a hard concept to get just to visualize. So don't feel bad if you're like, I don't understand, please explain it a different way, or explain it 75 times before you're like, I get it. But what I'm saying is an anterior tilt of the hip means my hip went forward. My hip can only go forward if I bend at the hip. Bending at the hip is called a flexion. It doesn't matter if my leg comes up or my hip goes down. How did that happen? I bent at my hip. It doesn't matter if my forearm comes to my brachial region or my brachial region comes to my forearm. It happened because I flexed at my elbow. So an anterior tilt is a flexion of the hip, essentially. The only difference is a flexion of the hip, my leg gets to come up. I get to kick it up. Boom. An anterior tilt, those muscles are pulling, my leg's on the ground, so it pulls my hips down. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. What I don't want you to confuse too is there is a difference between an anterior tilt and my spine moving. So remember, I can bend at my spine, but my spine really only does about that much. This is me actually bending at my hip. My spine is coming along for the ride, but I'm bending at my hip. My hip socket here is bending. And this is the same to it as this is. Hip socket's still the one that's letting me do that. So a flexion of the hip is really an anterior tilt of the hip. They're essentially the same thing going on. The only difference is this. I could be choosing just to flex my loose hip muscle, right? My hip muscle's nice and loose normally, and I flex it so I can kick a ball, right? So my hips are fine, I kick it. But if I have shortened hip muscles, I tend to always be in a flexion. And when I'm always in a flexion, that shows up as an anterior tilt of the hip. So short flexor muscles in your hips tend to create anterior tilts of the hip. Yeah? And we're going to go back over this when we get to all the muscles. But I'm trying to kind of also emphasize why should you care kind of stuff, if that makes sense. And I love what Mr. Ma is doing. Thank you. Ms. Savarino, please, talk to me.
Is it possible to have like a tilt going like laterally, like up, like that way? Because if I do my hip like some random movement, I can crack some like deep joints inside of it. I don't know if it's my SI or something, but I have to do it like this weird rotation to the left. And I remember my chiropractor, I don't know, can you just be like crooked from laterally versus anteriorly?
Yes. So what Ms. Savarino is talking about also happens. It's not as common, but it's common enough. You'll see it. And she's talking about a lateral tilt or a one-sided elevation. They're the same thing. And I'm tilting to the side, and what happens? My spine that's supposed to be straight laterally, right? My spine is supposed, I know my spine has curves front to back, but in front of me, if you guys were looking through me, my spine should be straight here. Well, if I lift up a hip here, all of a sudden that spine has got to go over here, right? And that is what people do that have scoliosis, is that's kind of what's going on there. But you don't have to have scoliosis to have that happen. Your hip could be up on one side because you could have problems with your leg muscles. By the way, you could be born this way. You could have one leg longer than the other, significantly. Everybody has one leg longer than the other, but significant enough that it really elevates one hip. And your spine has to compensate. So my spine right now in front of you guys is actually going like this. It's actually curving over to try to get me back over. It's kind of going like this, and my head's going back. My shoulders come over to try to compensate this way. My head comes back to compensate back. So I create a scoliosis to compensate for this hip coming up on one side. And that is called an elevation of the hip on one side or a lateral tilt. Yeah, same thing. And you're absolutely right, Ms. Savarino. And Ms. Savarino, it probably is your SI joint that you're popping. That's my guess. Because it's really the SI joint, which is a sacroiliac joint. The SI joint, that's the sacrum. See if I can get this guy to follow me. Good. The sacroiliac joint is the joint between my sacrum and my ilium. This is the back of the skeleton. And let me be
That's
very,
like right where I feel like the release
oh yeah.
too, so
and let me be very
it's
clear,
so
everybody.
fantastic.
This is the SI joint in front. You'll never touch this because there's intestines here. This is the connection between your sacrum and your ilium. So your entire upper body, you pick up a pencil, anything you do up here, your entire upper body is connected to your entire lower body via the sacrum ilium joint, sacroiliac joint. And it's right by the sacrum down here. Where the sacrum meets the ilium, which is why I'm really big on rubbing sacrums, because this fascia around here gets really tight trying to balance out that joint. Yeah? Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, oh, now you're going to look at the skeleton, huh? You got me? Come on. Come on. There we go. Okay. So, back to the pelvis. Based on Mr. Richards' original question, actually, this is the ilium. Now, if we have an anterior superior iliac spine, you can darn well better know we're going to have an anterior inferior iliac spine. And the fact that we made such a big deal there, anterior, should make you suspect that if we go posteriorly, we will actually have a posterior superior iliac spine, and we actually even have a posterior inferior iliac spine. You guys have probably felt the posterior superior iliac spine on people. It usually shows up kind of as those dimples that they have right here above their buns. Not exactly, but it's from that. It's also how you find the SI joint. If I find your if I find your posterior superior iliac spine and I link my fingers right in it, guess where I'm in? I'm in your sacroiliac joint. And you can even wiggle people's hips and actually feel it move a tiny bit in here. So that's why it's very useful for that, just for finding the sacroiliac joint. But let's go back to the front here really quick before we get to other stuff. So things of grave importance that attach to these things. We've been talking about things like the quads. I'm trying to get this guy's arm out of the way. Hold on, everybody. Let's move over here. Hold on, let's try this. Nope, come back to me. Good. So we've been talking about things like the quads. Your quadricep femoris muscles attach to your femur and go across down your knee. And the vastus lateralis hooks on the outside here and goes across the knee. The vastus intermedius hooks here in the red spot, actually, and goes across the knee. The vastus medialis hooks over here and goes across the knee. But the rectus femoris actually attaches to the anterior inferior iliac spine and goes across the knee. That is significant because it means that that muscle of your four quads can make you kick your knee out, but it can also make you flex your hip. And so if it's shortened, it can also cause an anterior tilt of the hip. So this means if you have a client that you think has back problems because they have an anteriorly tilted pelvis, you also want to rub their thigh. And because that muscle attaches here. Do you remember the sartorius? We haven't talked about it very much, but the sartorius is your most, by the way, this shouldn't seem completely familiar. We haven't done these muscles yet. I just kind of like to give you categories to fit information in that's coming up and to know why you're learning these bumps. So the anterior inferior iliac spine is important because the rectus femoris attaches to it. The anterior superior iliac spine is important because the sartorius attaches to it. The sartorius is not in any other muscle group. It is the most superficial thigh muscle you have, and it actually runs diagonal across your leg, across your knee, and hooks to the inside of your shin. The inside. It's a very interesting muscle that we'll learn about. It's nicknamed the Taylor's muscle. Anyway, so it attaches here too. But because it runs across the hip, it can create a, and it's in front, it can create a flexion of the hip. And because it can create a flexion of the hip, it can create an anterior tilt. Thank you for those of you. Some of you are mouthing it out. I love it. So those muscles are important. These thigh muscles are actually important back muscles because they can affect your back. And that's why these bumps here are so important. So when I massage somebody's thigh, I tend to massage till I run into this muscle, into this bone here, because I care about these connections. And I will come into your labs and show you over time how to kind of get in these areas without violating your client. So on this crest of the ilium, I really care about the anterior inferior iliac spine because the rectus femoris attaches to it. I care about the anterior superior iliac spine because the sartorius attaches to it. I care about the entire side of the crest of the ilium because a muscle called my tensor fascia lata hooks in here. My gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, and gluteus maximus attach on here. So all this surface area is very important to me, and all those attach down the femur. Then if we go to the back, you've got this ischium, right? It's a very strange bone because the ischium comes together with your pubic bone and creates this hole in here and stuff like that. But this ischium back here, look how, this is the back side of the skeleton. Look how this almost creates two handles for my hands to hold on to. All three hamstring muscles attach to your ischium. This is why when I'm rubbing up somebody's leg, I run up until I hit the bone. Because all three hamstring muscles run up into there. And it's literally like a big handle. And it's a big handle. Oh, it's a big handle to pull me back up. Those of you that like to work out, when you do stiff-legged deadlifts, you know you're doing them for your hamstrings. Because my hamstrings hook to my ischium back here. All three heads hook back here. There's four heads, by the way, but three heads hook to the ischium. Hook back here to literally pull me back up. So what do tight hamstrings cause? Yes, Mr. Richards.
Posterior tilt. Posterior tilt.
Posterior tilt, posterior tilt, posterior tilt, yes. Tight hamstrings can cause a posterior tilt. And what happens to the curves of my spine in a posterior tilt, Mr. Richards?
They extend?
They disappear, yes. Yeah, they disappear. You just start to get so straight because you're trying to stay over your center, and so you just kind of go to a military back.
Is that not an extension?
The problem is, in some areas it is, in some areas it's not. It's easier to say the curves disappear. Because, you know, I've got curves in my low back that go in, they start to go away, but I've got curves in my upper back that start to go away. My curve, you know what I mean? It's not really extension. In fact, sometimes an anterior tilt is more extension in certain areas, right? Anyway, but you have the right idea. So hamstrings can be a big culprit when you see that. So we now also see, could we get argument between hamstrings and quads? Yes, we can. We can get arguments between flexors and extensors. But we're not done there yet. Let's talk about some other cool stuff that happens down here. If we come back down to Mr. Skelly here, the pubic bone actually meets the ischium down here. It's why you have a hole down here. That hole is actually made by the pubic bone and the ischium meeting. Don't worry, I'm going to show you slides on this. Well, this whole area of the pubic bone down here and they call it the ramus of the ischium. It's the arm of the ischium. But this whole area between your legs, that's where all 5 of your hip adductors attach. Your pectineus, your gracilis, your adductor brevis, adductor longus, and in back here, adductor magnus. And there's got all this surface area, which is why anything I attach here will be between my legs, which is where all your adductors are. But you can see that if the adductor magnus is attached on the back part of this circle, it's still between my legs, but it's in the back side, and then all the other adductors stack up in front of it, and they go down the leg and attach here. Now, what happens if one side unilaterally of my adductors is tight? Miss Rader.
I'm not sure, but would it do like a tilted pelvis downward on one side?
Yeah, a lateral tilt actually. Because what happens is this side here tightens, and that pulls my pelvis here, and it does what Miss Savarino's talking about. So when we see lateral tilts of the pelvis, we tend to look for one side of the adductors being tighter than the other. Because in order for this leg to come over more, if it can't come over anymore, it pulls my pelvis to it. Boom. And so when I am tilted, I got to think about this. When my left side is elevated, it tends to mean my left adductors are tight. Left side elevated, adductors are tight. Left adductors are tight. Same side adductors are tight. So now we found that muscles in front, this is the cool part, I've been telling you this all along, muscles in front of my body tend to do flexions. So muscles in front here can do flexions of my legs, and thus they can create anterior tilts. Muscles in back tend to do extensions, and thus they can do posterior tilts. Muscles in between tend to do adductions, but in this case they can cause, if they're unilaterally tight, they could cause lateral tilt to my pelvis. And all of that can mess up my back and neck. For surezies. For surezies. So that's why a lot of these muscles are important. Okay? And let me think. And there's a couple other muscles I want to talk about before we take our break, and then I'll show you slides to make this all much more clear, to be very honest with you. So we also have some super important muscles we're going to learn about inside the hips that are very deep. The iliopsoas group, which is really 2 muscles. The psoas major actually hooks inside my lower back, inside underneath my tummy, and goes down across my hip. So it too creates a flexion of the hip. And I have a muscle called the iliacus that is attached inside my ilium, inside my pelvis here, and goes across the hip. And they both attach to the same spot, so we talk about them together. And that's called the iliopsoas. But that's actually 2 muscles. And because they cross here, they too help with flexions of the hip. This is why there's a difference between stomach crunches and sit-ups. Stomach crunches work my rectus abdominis. Sit-ups actually tend to work my iliopsoas more. Yeah? Yeah. So, glad you find this amusing. So that's the iliopsoas. And then the last but not least at all, we've talked a lot about the lateral hip rotators. Underneath the gluteus maximus, there are the deep 6 lateral hip rotators, and they are deep little muscles that kind of come from the sacrum and from the ischium here over to the femur, and they're kind of like the rotator cuff muscles for your hip. And do you remember the obturator internus and externus? Well, this hole here is called the obturator foramen. It's a foramen just means hole. Don't worry, we're going to go over all this in detail with slides over the next weeks. But this obturator foramen has an internal muscle that hooks over it and goes to the femur, and there's one on the outside of this hole that hooks over and goes to the femur. That's obturator internus, obturator externus. Gemellus superior, gemellus inferior. Piriformis comes from over, but that's where all those names come from, is from these parts. So as you're learning the bones, which is very boring, that's why I'm telling you all this, to try to get you excited about this, because it will be important. As you're learning all the bones, and you're like, why do I need to know about the anterior superior iliac spine, the anterior inferior iliac spine, the posterior superior iliac spine, the posterior inferior iliac spine, the arm of the ramus, the arm of the pubis, there's 2 arms of the pubis actually. Why do I need to know about all that stuff? It's because really cool muscles attach to them, and those really cool muscles that attach to them usually affect all sorts of things. Now, I'm relating it to backs because that's a very common thing you're going to see, but it also relates to athletic performance, right? If there are problems with these muscles in there. So anyway, that is a very good place for us to take our break and then come back and look at slides of this and kind of break this down a little bit piece by piece with pictures and such. I will see you guys back at 9:45. Thank you. Hopefully fill in some of the holes of what I just talked about. I will try to highlight what muscles attach to these bony landmarks. Remember, there are no accidental bumps on your body. Someone up there was thinking about all this when they made you. And so each one of these things, as you learn them, is going to be extremely important to learning about the muscles. I find that students that learn the bony landmarks really well learn muscles very quickly because they all relate so tightly. So feel free to ask me questions and all that good stuff. But again, all we're actually doing is bones. And tonight's homework, which I'm going to release before the end of class, will be all just about bony landmarks. That's the whole point. And by the way, after I release the homework, I'm going to step out. I have a 10:30 meeting. Miss Bauer will come back in at 11 just to say bye. So the last half-hour class I won't be here, but there's a teacher here. I'm here in the building. I'm here in spirit. I just want to explain to you when I didn't come back and say goodbye and she comes back instead. That's planned. Okay, let's do this thing. Let's take a look at your amazing pelvis. All right. So let's just look at this picture for a second because it's absolutely amazing, and there's actually some things within this picture that are very, very important to how you work. Does anybody have any idea what this big white strip is going down from the hip, down the thigh, across the knee, by the way? Miss Savarino, what is it?
Is it the IT band?
It is the IT band. Do you know what IT stands for? Okay, that was weird. No, you're good. I was just following up. IT band. Miss Savarino is right. Miss Rader, what does the IT band stand for?
The iliotibial tract.
Yes, iliotibial tract. Some people call it the IT band too, so iliotibial band. Look what she called it, by the way. This is the crest of the ilium, and this is your tibia down here. The bone, your shin bone is your tibia. So it is called the iliotibial band. if you think about it, if you take a trail, you're hiking on a trail, quite often we'll call it the Phoenix South Mountain Trail. It's the trail from Phoenix up the South Mountain thing. This really is named from the start and the end of this thing. This is a band of fascia. And it helps you do all sorts of things, but one thing it does is protect your knee from blowing out laterally, which is not pleasant. Just try to avoid that if you can in your lifetime. But what I want to point out to you about this incredible IT band is something that's really interesting. The gluteus maximus, this is your gluteus maximus here. Well, it's not yours, it's this person's gluteus maximus, but it actually feeds into the iliotibial band or tract. And this up here, this little muscle here is called your tensor fascia lata, and it too feeds into your iliotibial band. So your glutes that are tied in intimately with your low back are also tied in intimately with this band. So the iliotibial band can actually become tight when you have back problems. Again, I'm just trying to relate the legs to the back, and this is not a stretch though, they are intimately related. These are deep connections that are very prominent. And here we see all, by the way, all your adductor muscles and your hamstrings here and back. By the way, this diagonal muscle coming all the way from the front down here, all the way down here, that's the sartorius. This muscle coming down right here is your gracilis coming right down there. And they actually cross over your knees. So they have a lot to do with medial knee stability. Because think about it, when you're watching sports, what do you hear about? You always see some athlete running down the field, right? Especially in football, you see this. This is the problem because they're big guys. And they're running down the field, and what do? They cut. They cut left or right, but their knee doesn't cut with them. Their knee goes out medially or laterally, and those are the worst knee injuries. Well, these muscles here, the IT band, the iliotibial band or iliotibial tract on the lateral side helps to protect lateral blowout, and your gracilis and your sartorius and actually your semitendinosus hamstring muscle too help protect medial blowout, help to keep your knee stable, because knees do very good going flexion and extension. They do not like lateral and medial forces put on them. They do not like it at all. They're not designed for that. And if you get a 300-pound guy on top of that and all of a sudden he does that, you got all sorts of problems. Okay, moving right along. I'm not avoiding this because it's a naked, well, actually, I do want to show you some stuff here. So, stuff to remember here are the two boxes I have boxed out here. The greater trochanter and the anterior superior iliac spine. The anterior superior iliac spine really is these bumps on my hip. I can feel them on me, so I know you can feel them on you. They're kind of a bump down here. The greater trochanter is actually a bump I feel on the side of my leg, and it is your femur. It is the bump on your femur sticking out here on the side of your leg. These are very important to me as landmarks for massage therapists because I'm often working between the greater trochanter and the crest of the ilium. I'm often working between the anterior superior iliac spine and the femur. These give me an idea where the hips are and the femur is. Because the greater trochanter is a big bump on the femur, so it lets me know, hey, that's the femur. And the anterior superior iliac spine lets me know where the hips are. And I care where those are because the muscles are in between. And I'm often digging out the muscles from in between. That's why I care. On the back, I care about the posterior superior iliac spine because it helps me find what joint. You all failed today. Every last one of you. Zeros. Ms. Creo, can you help the class get A's again?
Sorry. I was screenshotting it. It's the sacrum, right?
That's true, but what joint does it help me find? The posterior superior iliac spine is on the hip, and it helps me find a joint. If I can find this thing, I can find a joint. I don't mean a doobie. I mean a joint, an articulation. Yes, Ms. Hendrickson, please.
The SI, the sacroiliac joint?
Yes. That little bump, if I go inside it medially, it leads me right to the SI joint, to the sacroiliac joint. And I'll show you pictures of that, but I'm just trying to kind of tell you why you would care. And you can feel this. You can feel the posterior superior iliac spine on people if you search for it. And it's right next to the sacrum. Yeah. And Miss Creo, you're right, by the way. It helps you. That's where the sacrum is. You're right about that. But I was looking for sacroiliac joint, where the sacrum and the ilium come together. Very cool. All right. Moving right along. We're not going to explore fascia. Okay. So remember again, your book. Oh, Miss Hendrickson, you still have your hand up. Did you have a question? No. Okay. Remember, your book has a really hard challenge here, and it's not your book's fault. It is trying to represent three-dimensional reality, three-dimensional anatomy in a two-dimensional space. So it's hard. So you got to use your imagination a lot here. But let's point out some things that are extremely important. I said all this before, but I want to say it again because I want you to hear it in at least 2 different ways, and then by the time you graduate, 37 different ways, 400 different times. So your hips, when you were a little baby, don't ask me when because I don't remember, honestly. It might have been while you were still in the womb. It might have been afterwards. But when you were a little baby, these were actually 3 different bones. The ilium was up here, the pubis was down here, and the ischium was here, and they were only connected by cartilage. And right here at this kind of triangulation point, they came together and they calcified. They became solid bone. And this hole here is your acetabulum. It's where, oh shoot, it's where your femur is going to go. The head of your femur here. They are now all one bone, but we refer to them separately. This is a side view, and this is your ilium. If this is your ilium, who can tell me what this bump is here in front? Miss Carrillo.
Is that the anterior superior iliac spine?
Yes, it is the in front upper spine of the ilium, anterior superior iliac spine. Cool, thank you. Somebody else, if that's correct, what's this bump below that one called? Mr. Singletary. Mr. Singletary? Mr. Singletary.
Sorry, I was talking and forgot to unmute myself.
So what's the bump below?
The anterior inferior iliac spine.
Yes, I love that. I love what he most likely did there, everybody. I suspect he didn't memorize that. He's now just using anatomy language. He just told us the bump that is found below the other bump on the front of the hip. So this is the anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine. Somebody else, what would this bump in back up here be called? Miss Hendrickson.
The posterior superior iliac spine.
Yes. Awesome. And finally, somebody else, what would this bump below that one be called? Anybody else who hasn't answered already? Miss Rader, please.
The posterior inferior iliac spine.
Posterior inferior iliac spine. Yeah. And this one, the posterior superior iliac spine, by the way, is the way I find the sacroiliac joint. Believe it or not, it's just on the other side of that. It helps me find this joint on the back side. Cool. I love that. Okay. And then we've got the pubic bone here. And you can actually feel this front part here, right? This is right above your reproductive organs. You can actually touch it. It's a bump right here. And there are adductor muscles that attach here, 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 and here. And there's a whole bunch of hamstrings that attach back here. And because this bone, this pubic bone, is kind of made up of 2 parts, there's a part up here and a part down here, we call those rami or ramuses. Rami mean arm, and this is the lower arm of the pubic bone, and this is the upper arm of the pubic bone. So, but we don't call it the upper, we call it the superior arm of the pubis, or the superior ramus of the pubis, and this is the inferior ramus of the pubis. So the inferior ramus of the pubis meets the ramus of the ischium to form this circle, which we call the obturator foramen, this hole in here. By the way, in a live person, it's not a hole. I mean, it is a hole. There's no bone there, but it's covered with fascia. covered with fascia. Anyway, we get back to the ischium. Do you see all these bumps on the ischium right here? We call that the ischial tuberosity, the ischial bumps, right? And that's where all the hamstrings hook to. It's very bumpy because the hamstrings have to have a lot of power to hook to that. Cool. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. By the way, this big bump here, does anybody know what this big bump on the femur is called here? You can feel this one. Miss Rader, please.
The greater trochanter.
Yeah. And guys, this is very important because when I'm massaging people, I'm normally massaging them when I care about their hips through here. I don't want to rub their greater trochanter. People don't enjoy that. I don't want to rub their hip bone. People don't enjoy that. All the meat is between these two areas. So if I can find the crest of the ilium and I can find the greater trochanter, I can cut through this area here. And by the way, right where my cursor is moving, this up on the side of your hip right here would be the, tensor fascia lata, gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, and gluteus maximus. There's 4 extremely important muscles here, not to mention all the deep 6 underneath all those. So this is all really important for those reasons. Moving right along. Boom. So your sacrum is considered to be part of the spine, and where the sacrum meets the ilium is the sacroiliac joint. It is the only bony joint you have, actual joint, between your entire upper body and your entire lower body. Here is another view of the ramuses of the pubis. Here's the superior ramus of the pubis, turns into the inferior ramus of the pubis, and eventually turns into the ramus of the ischium. Where your 2 pubic bones come together, they call this the pubic symphysis. They're playing in symphony. So your 2 sides of your pelvis are hooked together by your sacroiliac joints and your pubic symphysis. This is a cartilaginous joint here. For those of you that have been pregnant before, relaxin flowed through your body, right? An endorphin, a chemical messenger from your endocrine system, flowed through your body, and it told this cartilaginous joint to soften up so that you would widen your pelvis more easily and be able to birth a child through here. And thank God for that. So that's one of the main reasons you release relaxin is to release up this joint and the sacroiliac joints here so that you can widen this hole here and get a child's head through here. It's always the head that's the problem, right? Cool. Oh, and these pubic tubercles, some of your adductor muscles attached to them. One of my students told me they remember them as the pubic testicles, so they could remember these two bumps. I'm not trying to be vulgar, it's just an easy way to remember them. Pubic tubercles, but they're these 2 bumps on your pubic bone. That's what you're feeling up front. It's kind of that bone. Okay, this is a look from the backside. We are looking posterior at this person. We are looking at their bottom, right? We can see the sacrum here. We can see the femur. I want you to notice something really interesting. Do the femurs run straight up and down? No, no, no. They actually come in. Your body uses lots of triangulation. And by the way, this is why when I'm rubbing somebody's leg very hard on the outside laterally, I don't rub up it hard. Because if I rub up it hard, I run into the bone. I actually pinch the skin between the bone here. I prefer if I'm rubbing hard to go down so that I don't create a scissor action, a crossing up here when I go up. Now I rub up and down, but I rub up light, hard down when I'm rubbing on the outside of the leg for this reason. This is one of the things that anatomy helps you do, by the way, is even if you're not using it to figure out pelvic tilts and anterior and lateral and posterior and blah, 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 it helps you become a better rubber, right? You want to be better than the next guy. And just knowing that the femur runs this way makes me rub a person differently. It also makes me realize how much meat is on the inner thigh, by the way. It's a huge area. It's a high priority target. Ms. Hendrickson, please.
Yeah, I just had a comment because I definitely noticed that I'm a lot more likely to get bruised from massage. Like
in class, if it's like an area like that, like it'll be the same amount of pressure, like an arm or leg or something, but then once it gets to like the bony landmark, that's where it'll be like really uncomfortable. And sometimes I've got bruised like at my elbows or
Yeah.
like my hips and stuff like that.
Yes. So, and what's happening, what she's describing is a bruise is that we've broken interior blood vessels. We've created, by the way, internal bleeding. Luckily, it's not that big a deal. But two things have to happen for a bruise. I need pressure, and I need for the pressure not to be able to get away. And so if you push on my buns, there's all this give. But if you push on an area with a bone underneath it and you trap your pressure between your hand and that bone, that's where bruising occurs. And so Ms. Hendrickson is right. That's why we want to work very close to the bone, but we've got to be extremely cognizant of where the bone is. And there's two things that I don't like that happen. One is therapists aren't aware the bone is. They rub up the leg and they run over this greater trochanter all the time. They do it all the time. If you've done it, don't feel bad, because I know professional massage therapists, not just one, hundreds that do it all the time. They're terrible about it. They also don't realize it on the backside, and they run into it all the time. I don't like that. But I also don't like the therapists that leave this entire area of the body out because it's too bony, it's too complicated, and they're too afraid of people's privates to work in this area at all. And this is probably the most important area of the body. So instead, we're going to become very aware of what's in this area, learn to work around it very judiciously, because this is where all the cool stuff happens. This is what's really, really important. Mr. Richards.
Yeah, you said massage downward. Keep being told not to do downwards, to go up on the leg, on the extremities.
Yeah, and that's because you're trying to move stuff to the heart, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I agree with both those statements, and not because I'm trying not to create waves. Here's the point I want to make. This is why it's extremely important in a medical field. Okay, we're not computer programmers. If you're a computer programmer, I would essentially say you use this bit of code, this item to do the same thing every time, because that's what that item does. But in a medical field, you have to understand why you're doing what you're doing, because there will be exceptions to the rule, right? So if I'm doing big strokes and moving lots of blood around your body, I probably should be moving that towards the heart. And in general, I would move it towards the heart. I would agree with that statement. I rub up your leg, right? That is technically true. But if I am elbowing your IT band, ripping up your fascia, I'm not actually moving a lot of material around. I am doing very deep, intense work. And I think it's worth it to go down the femur so that I'm not scissoring, because what happens is you literally scissor your arm and the femur and pinch the little fascia in between there, and nobody hates pinching more than, people actually prefer deep. I'd rather you punch me than slap me. Does that make sense? I hate that stinging kind of sensation. Just if you guys get mad at me, just punch me, please. Don't slap me, right?
And if you go down, follow that with up.
Then if you go down, you're opening the scissors up instead of scissoring. And so it's a much better move for that. And so that's a good time to ignore that rule, because the other rule kicks in more. Does that make sense? And you guys have a third consideration, and this is a tough one. I'll tell you what my answer is to this, but my answer is not the only answer. If I only do upward strokes, I am missing every single downward stroke. And you still have to bring your hands back down to do another upward stroke. So I stroke both directions because I don't want to miss out 50% of my massage, because I'm on a race against time. And my argument is your body's circulating up and down all the time anyway, right? So I do sometimes follow the rule of only stroking up, but I only follow it when I think there's edema. And I want to stroke stuff back up to the heart and get it out of the extremities. And then I do. But then I'm thinking tube of toothpaste, squeezing stuff back up your body slowly. So for me, it's not worth it. And I go both directions for speed to get double the massage in, and for comfort on the IT band. But those are, I just want to be very, very clear to all of you. These types of questions you will have to answer for yourself. And I get so many students who are like, well, Ibarra says it this way and Bauer says it this way and you say it this way. don't worry about what we said, worry about why we said it and if it applies to your style of massage and in your situation, right? And I tell you, when I get the person in from New York, and this I'm just generalizing, but the person that comes in from New York who's like, my legs are killing me. I've been late on that flight for hours. My legs are killing me. We just fixed that. They don't want me to be like, they want me to get in a rut, yep. And then they throw me $50 and they walk out. And I know this for a fact. Now, when I get the other person that comes in and they say, it's very important that my circulatory system be in balance and everything like that, and I can tell they kind of care about this thing, that's a lighter massage, I might do that, right? You've got to kind of match it to the situation and the person. That's my thought on all that. But again, know why we're telling you what we're telling you so you know when to break the rules, right? And you guys do this in life with everything, by the way. You know not to be late at school, right? But you also know that you can get a speeding ticket if you go too fast. You have to measure that stuff out. You have to decide how important is it I don't get a ticket? How important is it I get to school? It's the last day of school and I can't miss any more time and I want to graduate. I want to get a ticket. I got loads of time. I've got extra time. I don't want to get a speeding ticket. You kind of have to make these balanced decisions. Mr. Singletary, please.
Just my opinion. I think you both are right.
We are. That's my point.
I'm thinking of effleurage. Because we're going up, stroking up, and you're coming back down.
Yeah.
Stroking back up and stroking back inside.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion. I think you're both right.
And I'm not trying to sell it to you. Well, I am trying to sell it to you, but I'm honestly not trying to kind of wax over it for you. I'm glad that you're hearing two different opinions because when you leave here, you'll hear 13 more, right? But I want you to be intelligent therapists to be like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but that doesn't outweigh this other thing I'm trying to accomplish. Or maybe it does outweigh this other thing I'm trying to accomplish. I'm going to start doing it your way. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you, sir. Well said. Okay, cool. Okay, so what else do I want to tell you about this? Oh, back here on the back of the femurs, you're going to see this thing that's called the medial lip of the linea aspera and the lateral lip of the linea aspera. My teacher told me this thing 27 years ago, and it stuck with me. My parents used to have a garden in the backyard, and apparently my teacher did too. And he says, I always remember that I have a line of asparagus in my backyard. I don't even think that's the greatest thing in the world, but it was unusual enough that I remembered it for 27 years, so I suspect you will too. So you have a line of asparagus in your backyard garden, and that line of asparagus creates two lips, a medial lip and a lateral lip. What is important about these lips is, believe it or not, your quadricep muscles attached to them. So your quads are huge, and they wrap around from the front of the leg to the side of the leg, kind of almost to the back in some ways. And we're going to find out that your vastus lateralis, for example, hooks to the lateral lip of the linea aspera. Your vastus medialis hooks to the medial lip of the linea aspera. You don't have to memorize that stuff. I just want you to know why this stuff is important. You see a little line up here called the pectineal line. What muscle do you think attaches to the pectineal line? The pectineus. Yes, I will answer for you. Sorry. Pectineus. And we're going to find that there's just boatloads of stuff attached to the greater trochanter. It's huge. If you got a bump this big, it's an important bump. There's gluteal tuberosity because the gluteus maximus attaches to that and your iliotibial tract. So all sorts of important stuff here. I just want you to kind of remember. That's it. That's it for now. Oh, okay. This is a very strange view. This view, can you see me over here? Hold on one second. Hold on. Oh, yeah. This view over here is literally like I'm laying on the floor looking up the skeletons. You know, inappropriately looking up the skeleton's skirt, all right? This is you laying on the floor looking up between the legs of the skeleton, just so you know how you're looking here. Here's the pubic symphysis. Remember, this is cartilage, so it has a little give to it. And here is the superior ramus of the pubis, the inferior ramus of the pubis, meeting the ischium down here. And this is where all your adductor muscles attach between your legs, from here all the way to about back here. Adductors are super important and they're often forgot. I mean, you've got 3 hamstrings, 4 quads, and 5 adductors. And you can see the anterior superior iliac spine, the anterior inferior iliac spine, all that good stuff here. Cool. Here's a side view again. You've got these things, by the way, inside. This is not as important, but I want to explain to you why you're learning them. On your ilium here, you've got this huge surface area on the side, and you've got things called like the anterior gluteal line and posterior gluteal line. This is where your glutes attach to, and that's why they're going to bring them up later. These are lines where your glutes, remember you got 3 glutes attached to, and that's why they're going to bring them up. Just wanted you to know why they're referring to that. Boom, boom, boom. And this lesser and greater sciatic notch are very important because your sciatic actually comes from underneath your sacrum and comes out these notches and runs down your leg. And guess what goes over these notches? Your lateral deep 6 hip rotators. Not all of them, but some of them, especially the piriformis. Piriformis comes from the sacrum here and goes across to here. So it actually goes across the nerves coming out of the greater sciatic notch. And that's how it can pinch the sciatic nerve. And it will make more sense when we see the muscles. Right now, all I'm trying to do is get you motivated to care about the bumps on these bones. Okay, and it gets even more confusing, but what they're saying is if you cut the hip from inside and you looked at the inside of it from one side, so they are looking at this part of the hip over here from the inside. You've stuck your head inside somebody's pelvis now. So this is the pubic symphysis right here, because there's another pubic bone not attached here. There would be a sacrum over here if we attached it here. And they're going to have you name all these little spots in your open book test that I'm about to release right now. And then they will have you look at the outside and name all this stuff. Please, I don't mind that you're going to copy it out of the book. That's fine. That makes perfect sense to me. But while you're doing it, think about it. Think about what they're telling you, because a lot of it really makes sense. We go, oh, this is the iliac crest. Well, it makes sense that this is now the anterior superior iliac spine. It makes sense this is now the posterior superior iliac spine. It makes sense this is the anterior inferior iliac spine. It makes sense this is the posterior. It makes sense this is the superior notch. It makes sense this is the inferior notch. You guys know enough anatomy now that you can start to use your words to guess your way through it, right? We would hope that if you just were given this, you could start to kind of piece it together and be like, well, it must be this thing. I know what anterior means. I know what posterior means. I know what inferior means, all that kind of stuff. And that's what this exercise is supposed to get you to do in tonight's homework. And that